I was born, actually, 2 months before the end of World War II, on April 9th in 1945, while my dad was serving on the continent. And towards the end of the war, it was actually very interesting, because as they moved further into Germany, the not the NATO allies, because NATO hadn't formed until 1948, but the allies, as they moved into Germany, they realized that they had concentration camps. And they realized that inside the concentration camps were a lot of Jewish people. In fact, virtually all the Jewish people. And as it turned out, over 6 million of them. And as the Allies came close to these camps, the Germans did a lot of different things to try to disguise what they had been doing. That is to say, slaughtering them. And it wasn't just Jews, by the way. It was Russians, homosexuals, gypsies, as they were then called, Roma as they're now called, and political prisoners. Anybody who politically disagreed with the Nazis were thrown into these camps. And the Nazis used the camps to try and burn them and turn them into soap and into lampshades. As the Allies got to these camps, they realized that they had camps with people where roughly 20,000 people per day were dying from hunger. They were so frightened of what was happening that just in some instances, just to talk to them, just to say, hey, stand over here. If you did it with 20 people, 4 or 5 people would just die from fright. It was a terrible thing. And they realized that nobody spoke their language. So what they did was they sent out word through the Canadian forces, and probably the Americans as well. Anybody who spoke Yiddish, which was the one language that the Jewish people all spoke at the time, and still speak nowadays. My dad did speak Yiddish, so he was yanked out of the lines. He was in the front lines of Holland. And he was put in to talk to these prisoners. And it was so awful. I think my dad, he didn't want to talk about it. From 1945 till 1985, he never said a word, wouldn't ever say anything. I remember I lived in Germany in 1955, which was 10 years after the end of the war. My dad was still in the Army with the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery, and he had gone back one weekend to one of the camps, and he was the saddest, most upset that I have ever seen him. And he never told me for 40 years what he had done. And what he had done was he had gone back to try to remember all those thousands of people. He said that he personally witnessed like 40,000 of them dying. They were just so weak. They had been starved for like 3 to 6 months, and they were in terrible, terrible shape, and were dying. And many of them, I'm happy to say, were so happy because they realized towards the end that they were being saved, even though it didn't particularly pertain to them, because most of them were dying. If you hadn't eaten for 6 months, it's kind of hard to keep on going, you know. And it was impossible for a lot of them to actually take down food. They couldn't keep in the food. You tried to give it to them. They wound up giving a lot of them food by injection, sugar water. The problem with that was these people were walking skeletons, and you had to be able to try and find a vein on them in order to put in the food, the sugar water. So many of them died, it was just awful. That's why I say what I knew about my dad, and I knew a lot of the other fellows who worked in the war, and in fact I was so kind of struck by it that I wound up joining the Army. So I spent 22 years in the regular Army myself, and another 22 years in the militia, for what it's worth. So do I remember things to do with World War II and the poppy and the people that were involved? Absolutely. I even know some Silver Cross mothers who for me are the saddest. It's one thing for you or your friends to die. It's another thing for a mother to have a kid who dies. It's a killer.
Thank you.
Did that work okay for you?